In this video, we'll cover some of the basics of forensic anthropology, including how to identify certain characteristics by simply looking at a set of skeletal remains. Now, forensic anthropology is an applied form of anthropology. It's when we take what we've learned in the classroom, what we know about the human body, and we use it for some practical setting. So forensic anthropology is typically used in conjunction with legal systems. Forensic anthropologists often work with medical examiners' offices. They work with police investigators to determine who a person is based on their bones, or also to determine perhaps what happened to this person during their lifetime, what's happened to them around the time of their death, or what's happened since they passed away. So forensic anthropologists can identify individuals by determining things like their sex and their age, and they can also look at larger populations to determine perhaps health effects that were common within the community or other forms of injury or disease. Now, there are a number of characteristics that forensic anthropologists can identify based on a set of skeletal remains. These are things like sex, so male or female, a person's age, their relative stature, or the build of their body. We can also estimate a person's ancestry, and we can determine something about their background. It should be fairly obvious that if we look at these two individuals, a little girl and an older gentleman, that their bones are going to be different from one another. So this is the basic premise of forensic anthropology, that people's bones look different, and we can use those differences to figure out who someone is. When we're doing these types of identifications, we have to compare whatever it is that we're looking at, whatever set of skeletal remains, we have to compare that to a set of skeletal remains where we know who all of those people are. And that's what we mean by the fact that we must compare to a known population. So for example, if as a forensic anthropologist I have a skeleton in front of me and I want to figure out who this person is, I want to also have a bunch of other skeletons where I know these 50 people are men, these 50 people are women, or these people are over the age of 50, these people are teenagers, these people are in their 20s. I want to know which people are of African ancestry, which people of European ancestry, and so on. Because humans exist along this sort of sliding scale of diversity. So we can't just look at a skull and say, ah, yes, this is certainly an Asian man in his 40s. We have to look at other skeletons in order to make those determinations. So the first characteristic that we can identify on a skeleton is a person's sex. And I should say that this is more about estimating a person's sex because there is a lot of middle ground. There's a lot of crossover between male characteristics and more typically female characteristics. But if we start at the skull or the cranium, we can see that male crania are generally more robust than females, which just means that male skulls are a little bit thicker and they have more pronounced features. So for example, the brow ridge on men tends to be a little bit more pronounced or exaggerated than the brow ridges on females. Also, the male skulls tend to have a more sloping sort of forehead, whereas female skulls are more rounded and globe-shaped. Men tend to have more pronounced jawlines, sort of the squarer jaw, whereas women will tend to have jaws that are a little less angular, less square. Men have more pronounced chins, and women have less pronounced chins. There's also a feature called the mastoid process, which is right here. It's a little difficult to see in the photograph, but in men, the mastoid process tends to be a little bit more elongated and pointy, and in women, it's a little bit more dulled. It's worth noting, however, that you needn't see all of those male characteristics on a skull in order to determine that that individual is a male. And you don't have to see all of the female characteristics. Many people, most people in fact, have somewhat of a mix between some more feminine and more masculine characteristics. So this is still just an estimate. There are certainly many women who have square jaws and pronounced eyebrow ridges. There are certainly many men who have, globe-shaped heads and less strong chins. So this is just an estimate saying, based on the characteristics, this skull looks more like it is male or more like it is female. We can also look at the postcrania, meaning everything from the neck down, to assess a person's sex. So male long bones, meaning the bones of the arms and the legs, tend to be longer and more robust than the long bones of females, and that's because we do have a slight bit of sexual dimorphism within our species. So if we want to figure out how tall a person is, we take their femur, which is the thigh bone, and put it on what's called an osteometric board, and this will help us estimate a person's height. Now, this is still relative. Some people just have longer legs than others, and so that might affect our reading. There's also a lot of crossover here as well. If we get a leg bone and we estimate that based on that leg bone the person is 6'4", then it's more likely that individual will be a man than a woman. Same if we find a leg bone and we estimate the person's height is 4'10". It's more likely to be a woman, but we certainly know that there are some men in our population who are much shorter and some women in our population who are much taller. And if we find a leg bone that estimates at 5'7", that's going to be really difficult to say this is a man or this is a woman. So the femur isn't necessarily the best place to estimate a person's sex, but if all you have is a femur, then that might be what you have to go on. Now, the best place to estimate a person's sex is going to be the pelvis, and that's because the male pelvis and the female pelvis have different jobs to do, different responsibilities, or put a better way, the female pelvis has an extra job to do because the female pelvis has evolved to support pregnancy and also facilitate childbirth. So in general, the human female pelvis is a little bit broader, but really it's more open than the male pelvis. So it's not that every woman just has bigger hips than every man. It's that the female pelvis is more open to allow for carrying a child and then also giving birth. We can see this general openness, and you can think of it like a salad bowl. Men have a shallow salad bowl for a pelvis, and women have a deep salad bowl. You can get more salad in that bowl. So men, in that more closed off pelvis, we can see that in a couple of different characteristics. The first characteristic is the sciatic notch. Now, the sciatic notch is on the back of the pelvis, just to sort of orient ourselves in this image on the top right. This crest right here is called the iliac spine, and this portion right here to the left, that's basically where you feel your hip bone on the front of your pelvis. So the sciatic notch is sitting at the back. In women, the sciatic notch is more open. There's a wider angle there. And in men, the sciatic notch is more closed. And the way that we determine openness or closeness, the sort of rough way to do it, is you just stick your thumb right in there. And if the sides of the bone sort of line up with the sides of your thumb, then that's indicative of a more closed pelvis, and it's more likely to be male. If the sides of the sciatic notch don't touch your thumb, then it's more likely to be a female pelvis because it's more open. The next characteristic is the pelvic outlet. This is essentially the birth canal, but since men don't give birth, we call it a pelvic outlet. In women, the pelvic outlet is a little bit more open, and it's less obstructed by the tailbone. But in men, the pelvic outlet is less open, it's more constricted, and the tailbone tucks underneath. Now, it's important to recognize that the reason why this tailbone is important is because in women it needs to be a little bit further back so that it doesn't get in the way of childbirth, because this is the opening where a child goes through during the birthing process. So if the tailbone is in the way, that could be a problem in birth. The final characteristic is called the pubic arch. This is at the front of the pelvis. So at the front we see the two pubic bones coming together, and they join here with a piece of cartilage. This is called the pubic symphysis. So if we look just below the pubic symphysis, we can see this angle called the pubic arch. In men, the pubic arch is more V-shaped because, again, the whole pelvis is more constricted. But in the female pelvis, we see the pubic arch is more U-shaped, which indicates an openness to the pelvis. So all of these characteristics are really about not just the empirical size, but about how open or closed the pelvis is. And just like with the cranium, some women are going to have pelves, that are a bit more closed, and some men are going to have pelvises that are a bit more open. There's a lot of crossover in these characteristics. So we're still just estimating a person's sex, and we would want to take the pelvic differences and compare that also to cranial differences. And we'd say, all right, the skull looks more male, the pelvis looks more male, this is most likely going to be a male or female or whatever. After we've determined a person's sex, we next move on to estimating a person's age. And age is going to be a really important characteristic, especially if you're thinking, I have a skeleton in front of me, maybe I have a list of missing persons, and I want to cut that list down. I've already excluded one entire sex, now I want to figure out how old is the person I'm looking at. If we start with the pelvis, there is one place on the pelvis that can give an indication of a person's age. And this is at this pubic symphysis again, where the two pelvic bones come together. Now the method that's used to estimate a person's age, it's called the Suki-Brooks method. And it essentially, if we were to open up this pelvis, take out this piece of cartilage and open it up and look at the face of the pubic bones, what we would see is that the face looks somewhat like this, and there are a series of bony ridges that cover the entire face of the pubic bone. These bony ridges sort of lock into the cartilage at that joint. But because the pelvis gets a lot of stress throughout our lifetime just from all of our daily activities, walking around, running, jumping, everything we do puts a little bit of stress on that particular joint of our pelvis. So over time, the pubic symphysis, or the face of the pubic bones, are going to start to wear down a little bit. So when we're young, we still have all those nice, beautiful ridges at the pelvic or the pubic bone, but as we get older, those pubic faces start to wear down a bit. So in the Suki-Brooks method, there are 6 classes representing the youngest age here and the oldest age over here. And there are different sets for men and for women, because in women, childbirth can also affect the face of the pubic bones. There's a lot of overlap in the groupings of these particular sets of characteristics. So for example, the earliest stage would be, 14 years through 20 years. The second stage would be 18 years through 30 years. The next one would be 25 through 50. The next would be 35 through 70. So there's a lot of overlap there. This isn't the best place to estimate a person's age, but if the pelvis is all you have, this is the method that you would use. The best way to estimate a person's age is by looking at their teeth. And that's because our teeth tend to come in at pretty regular times. So if you look at humans within a population or all over the world, there's an average age at which our teeth come in. So when we're children, we have our baby teeth, which are also called deciduous teeth, and those start to come in when kids are about a year old, 9 months old or something. But then kids start to lose those teeth around 6 years of age. It's also at 6 years of age that our first permanent teeth start coming in. And specifically, we're looking at the molars. These are the teeth in the back. So children, when they just have their baby teeth or deciduous teeth, they don't have any molars, and molars are just part of the adult dentition. The first molar comes in around 6 years old. The second molar comes in around the age of 12. The third molar, or the wisdom tooth, on average, it comes in when people are around 18 years old, but that's extremely variable. Some people get their wisdom teeth when they're 16. Some people don't get them until they're in their 30s. Some people don't get wisdom teeth at all. So that's a little bit more iffy in terms of estimating a person's age. But essentially, think of it like you find someone's skull and you see that they have a first molar, but not a second molar. You would say, all right, I know this person is at least 6 years old, but they are less than 12 years old. If you find someone with first and second molar but no third molar, you would say this person is at least 12 years old but probably not 18 years old. If If you find someone with all three, you'd say this person is at least 18 years old. But then if we want to go beyond 18 years, if we have someone that we think is, in their 30s or 40s or beyond, the way that we can use their teeth to estimate their age is by looking at the amount of wear that has occurred to those teeth. So throughout our lifetime, as we use our teeth regularly every day for chewing, digesting our food, our teeth get a little bit worn down. And so we can essentially look at the amount of wear on those three molars, and we can see the difference in the levels of wear between them. So for example, if we look at the amount of wear on the first molar and the amount of wear on the second molar, if we see a difference, and we will see a difference in the amount of wear between those two teeth, we know that the difference in them is the amount of wear that has happened in 6 years. It's the 6 years between the times of eruption. So basically the first molars had 6 more years of wear than the 12-year molar. We can then take that amount of wear and apply it to the 18-year molar or the third molar and say, all right, if I see that X amount of wear happens in 6 years, and I know that there has been 4X amount of wear on the third molar, that means there's been 4 times as much wear on the 18-year molar than what I saw in the difference between the 6 and the 12. That would mean 4 times 6 is 24. 24 plus 18 is what, 42? So I would estimate that based on the person's dental wear, the person is in their early 40s. So that's the general way that you would use tooth eruption and wear to estimate a person's age. Now, it's also going to be important to have a basic understanding of the types of foods that a person ate, because some foods will induce more wear than other types of foods. Today, most of the food we eat is relatively soft. We don't even have to spend that much time chewing up our food. You can just kind of suck on it and it dissolves in your mouth. But in some cultures, and certainly in the past throughout history, there are different societies that have had a lot tougher food, and especially around grains that have been ground up to make into bread or flatbreads or whatever. In many societies, the way that grains were ground is by crushing them between 2 stones. But when you do that, part of the stone also gets ground up into that sort of grain meal. And so essentially people would end up, this happened a lot, for example, in Mexico, when people would grind up corn over the last several thousand years. Parts of the stones they were using to grind the corn would also get ground up, and so it would introduce essentially sand into the cornmeal. So every time people would cook with that cornmeal and eat it, they would also be eating a little bit of sand with that, which would wear down their teeth faster. So understanding the diet will also tell us a little bit about how teeth have worn down over time. Another way to estimate a person's age is by looking at the fusion of their bones. And this is called epiphyseal fusion. So when we are born and when we're young children, our bones are in lots of different parts. They haven't fully fused because these areas of fusion, you can see sort of right here, this line, that's a growth plate. And that growth plate has to remain open or unfused throughout a person's early life, because as soon as it fuses, then growth has ended. And in this picture, we can see a femur. This is the bottom part of a femur or thigh bone. This is from an individual who is still growing, because their bone is in 2 parts. You have the shaft part of the bone, which is called the diaphysis, and the end part of the bone, which is the epiphysis. And between those two is the growth plate. These growth plates close at specific times throughout our adolescence and early adulthood. So for example, here we see in an x-ray of the bottom of the femur and the top of the tibia. So for example, if the bottom of the femur fuses between the ages of 15 and 21, and the top of the tibia fuses between the ages of 16 and 25, if we find a skeleton where this one has fused but this one has not, we would say, okay, since this bone is fused, this person is at least 15 years old, but because this one has not fused, they are less than 25 years old. So we can use these growth plates or the epiphyseal fusion as a way of sort of bracketing how old someone is based on where they are in their growth span. The final characteristic that we would want to estimate from a skeleton or a set of skeletal remains is a person's ancestry. Now this is a little bit tricky to do because, again, humans exist along a broad spectrum. And we've talked before in this class about how race is not biologically real, but essentially when we're estimating a person's ancestry, we're trying to identify what race is this person. So it's kind of a catch-22 for anthropologists. How can we say that race doesn't exist and then yet turn around and identify someone's race based on their skeleton? Well, in this context, it's important to remember that race and the racial categories that we deal with today, these are all categories that have been made up by humans. But that doesn't mean that there aren't different physical characteristics that are shared by people who are more closely related. So we can say that in general there are going to be some characteristics that are more typical of African populations, some characteristics that are more typical of European populations, some characteristics that are more typical of Asian populations, and so on. We have to understand, again, a lot of crossover in these characteristics. So the best way to estimate a person's ancestry is by looking at their skulls. Facial features tend to contain those small physical differences more than any other part of the body. For example, the eye sockets or orbits of different populations will have slightly different characteristics. Asian populations tend to have more circular orbits, African populations tend to have more rectangular orbits, and European populations tend to have rectangular or what's called aviator glasses orbits. So they're sort of rectangular, but they kind of cut in right here, so they're a little bit slanted diagonally. The nasal aperture of skulls might also be used to estimate a person's ancestry. For example, in African populations tend to have a broader nasal aperture. The best characteristic for identifying, like the one foolproof way of estimating or identifying a person's ancestry, is one particular characteristic called synodonty. Synodonty means shovel-shaped incisors, and this is a characteristic that only appears in East Asian populations. However, not all East Asian populations, not all people from East Asia have this characteristic, but when we see it, it does always indicate some sort of East Asian ancestry. In synodonty, it's essentially that the incisor, or the front teeth, rather than just being straight or flat across, like a European incisor or an African incisor, it sort of curves around to the back just a little bit. So that's where it gets the name shovel-shaped, because it kind of looks like a shovel. So when we see this in a skeleton, we can be assured of some sort of Asian ancestry, but we have to keep in mind that there are populations in the world today where people have East Asian ancestry even though they are not identified as East Asian. And that would be indigenous communities in North and South America. So Native Americans, for example. We know that Native Americans migrated into North America from East Asia about 15 to 20,000 years ago. And one of the things that they brought with them, in addition to culture and stone tools, they also brought with them that synodonty characteristic. It doesn't persist in all Native American populations, but it's there in some. So that's when we might see that characteristic showing up. But just like with everything else, determining a person's ancestry is going to be tricky. We also have to keep in mind that populations are really mixed. A lot of us have lots of different parts of our ancestry, and perhaps all three. So that might make estimating a person's ancestry a little bit more difficult. So these are the characteristics that can be used when we're looking at a set of skeletal remains. We can estimate a person's sex, a person's age, a person's height or body stature, and we can also estimate their ancestry. Using all of these, we're hopefully able to identify who this person was in their lifetime, and then we move on to figuring out what happened to them in their life, what happened to them around the time of their death, and what happened to them after they died. And the way that we determine those characteristics are all covered in a separate video lecture.